Hello, my name is Professor Jennifer Nickel-Victor. I'm an associate professor of political science in the Schar School, where my area of expertise is in American government, particularly the US Congress and political parties and things related to that. But today I'm here to talk about elections and election administration and voting with three wonderful experts that I'm very excited to bring to our Schar Conversations series. So with us on the podcast today, we have Brenda Cabrera, who is in the lower left down there, I think, if everybody sees the same view I do. Brenda is the Director of Elections for the city of Fairfax in Virginia. She's worked for 32 years in both large and small Virginia jurisdictions. Brenda knows that securing elections is vital to voter engagement and confidence. In 2020, the city of Fairfax has already held 3 elections, one on Super Tuesday at the early onset and concerns of the COVID-19 virus, and then 2 more back-to-back in the midst of statewide closures, and then in the early days of reopening and reconnecting services. Brenda is a certified election registration administrator. So this is her career, this is what she does, and we are very thrilled to have her on the podcast. Brenda, hello and welcome.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for having me.
Great. We also have with us today Kristen Wright. Kristen is George Mason University's Director of Civic Engagement. And if you didn't know that George Mason University has a Director of Civic Engagement, I'm even more thrilled for you to meet Kristen. In this capacity, Kristen collaborates with students and faculty and community partners to incorporate civic learning and engagement into academic courses and the student experience. So Kristen, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
We also have Jean Thoensen. Jean is a Schar School student. She is also a chief election officer and assistant supervisor of an early voting center in Fairfax County. She works closely with the Office of Elections to improve poll worker training. She is majoring in public administration and government analytics at George Mason University. She is a former student of mine, a STAR student, I should add, and I'm very thrilled to have her and her expertise with us on the podcast today. Jean, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Great. So let's get started. I'm going to describe the format to the audience here, as we've talked about among the panelists already. I have 2 sort of preloaded questions for each of the panelists that I'm just going to use as conversation starters, but hopefully engage in a fair amount of dialogue between the 3 of us as we try to pinpoint really what the dangers are, where the areas of concern are that are ahead of all of us now as we think about voting and elections during a pandemic, and what we as George Mason, City of Fairfax, County of Fairfax residents, faculty, staff, students can be and should be doing about it, and all the ways in which the 2020 election differs from any other election that we may have participated in the past. So on that note, let me start with Brenda. Brenda, can you tell us what are the biggest challenges that your office faced during the administration, let me start with the past, I guess. I'm going to rephrase my question. Thinking about the elections that we've already had, that you've already held, the experience that you've had administering elections during COVID-19 outbreak, what are the most important lessons that you have learned so far?
So thank you for that question. I think as we look back on it, one of our biggest challenges was securing the PPE for our office and for our election officers. And then in that context, trying to retain election officers who were comfortable in working. We had quite a few who dropped out in March 3rd on Super Tuesday. We were really on the leading edge of the pandemic. We certainly had heard that it was coming. The only PPE that we had for that election, I ran out to Harris Teeter and got some disinfectant wipes, and that was kind of it. You know, they wiped off pens and so forth. That seemed even proactive in that period of time, if you can think back to when this wasn't what it is today. And we had several, I think less than 4 officers who called in and said, you know what, I'm not comfortable working in this environment. And then within 2 weeks, we were in a total lockdown here in the city, so you couldn't get into the building without an appointment. and we had to change everything. So all of our absentee voting became curbside voting. We would get a call, we put out signs, and we would get a call from a voter out at the curb on the side of the building, and they would call us and we would take everything down for them to vote outside. And slowly people were donating masks and so forth for us to use, but you just kind of didn't know from day to day what you were going to have. So there was this greater level of stress and not quite panic, but a little bit, just to keep people safe, not sure what things were going to look like, and not sure even what the election would look like once we got there.
Was it sort of reinventing systems on the fly? Like, did it feel like you had a plan in place that you were implementing, or did it feel like you were making it up?
Yes, all of those things. I think it felt like we were relying on systems that were in place, but not necessarily for like we had not really planned for a pandemic. But we always do curbside voting. So we knew how to do curbside voting. We made a few tweaks to it in terms of providing the voter with a surface that then they could keep, right? So we started cutting up cardboard, and we would give them their ballot on a piece of cardboard so they could write on it. So that kept us from taking back a clipboard that we would normally use and then having to do that. So we had systems in place that we tweaked a little bit. We did think about doing drive-through voting, where we just set up everything outside, and that made me nervous because of weather. So I was happy to kind of get to more of a in-person thing. And then the other thing that we did, which was new for us, is we really pushed the vote at home message, put out a lot of communication about vote at home. And in the May election, it was a very personal election to the city because it was mayor, council, and school board. And those candidates became very involved in trying to keep people safe, sending out applications to voters. So we went from like a normal of 67 ballots sent out to the public in 2018 to more than 3,000 sent out for the May election. So that did change our process. Again, we've always done absentee, but never at that volume. So I probably should have asked this first, but can you just describe the lay of the land? So for George Mason folks who are listening to this, so the city of Fairfax, technically George Mason University resides in the county of Fairfax, right? Yes.
But it feels like it resides in the city of Fairfax because it's right there adjacent to the city government buildings and so forth. If you just leave campus down University Drive, right there on the left is all of the city of Fairfax government center and the mayor's office and everything that's involved. But for listeners who may not be as familiar, give us the lay of the land of city of Fairfax, population wise, and what's typical voter turnout like? How many election or polling places do you usually host during an election? And how did those, you just gave a little bit of the numbers about how absentee balloting differed, but fill out that picture a little bit more for us.
Sure. So the city of Fairfax is actually, it's an independent locality. It's not related to Fairfax County. We do have some shared services, but we're an independent locality with our own governing body of the mayor and the council and the school board. So we have a relationship with Fairfax, but we are independent. Geographically, we're like a donut hole in Fairfax. So we sit in the middle of Fairfax County at about 25,000 in population, and then in about 17,000 with voters. 16 plus of those are active voters in the county. So normally for a May election, it's really the core city residents who vote in that election, where we might get 82, I think, % in the last presidential election.
Oh, wow.
I'm not a mathematician, I'm sorry, like somewhere between 10 and 12,000. For this election, we normally get just under or just above 3,000.
Mm-hmm.
So for this election in May, we actually had 3,500. So by increasing the messaging and the method that people could vote, we actually increased the turnout in an election where potentially nobody could have showed up because, of the problem with the pandemic. And we did have voting on election day. We have 6 precincts that open on election day, and then we have our central absentee precinct, which is separate. They handle the absentee. So 6 precincts, we had no trouble. We have great facility partners. They all opened on time, and about, I think, 900 or so people voted on election day for that election. And then for the June election, we had less absentee, more voting on election day, and less overall, but we still had a higher percentage of turnout for both of those elections than what we call a like election in a previous year.
Interesting.
So that was interesting. And never knowing, like, if we had all this, when you have a lot of absentee like that and such a big increase, does that mean more people are voting absentee, or does that mean more people are voting? So right, having not done this before, we weren't sure what to expect on election day, whether that meant because there was so much publicity about it, we would also have record election day turnout as well as the record absentee turnout.
Right. And did you, in your polling, in your live in-person polling places, did you have any particular issues that you want to be sure to avoid in the future, or did it run more or less the way that you hoped?
So by the time I got to May 19th, I had a vision of what I wanted it to run, and it ran the way we wanted it to run. We felt really good about the things that we had spent our time and money on to protect our officers and our voters. It was a pretty comprehensive plan. I was really impressed with my fellow city departments, the sign people, Parks and Rec. It was actually having these sort of weekly COVID emergency phone calls allowed us to say things like, we would really love to have canopies so that we can keep voters outside, right? So Parks and Rec, I get an email from Parks and Rec, hey Brenda, we have canopies, we'll set them up the day before, take them down the day after.
Awesome.
So we had a lot of things like that, whether it was two-way radios or signs, people coming to us with solutions. The biggest problem that we had, I would say, once we got the logistics put together, was staffing, and people who would literally decide the day before that May election that they weren't comfortable working. And every time someone says that, it's just disheartening, because you certainly don't want to push people to do something they're not comfortable with, but it puts the officers who are working in a tough position. And then in March, we had the same thing, but we actually had a number of staff professors from George Mason who started emailing and calling us and saying, hey, we would really like to help. And whoever sent that idea out to the staff at GMU, we really appreciate that, because you kind of knew you were getting someone who really cared about helping the voters in that. And that was, and again, just from an encouragement standpoint, when you're trying to staff, to get that kind of an influx, it was really encouraging and really helpful.
That's great. That's really great. So the last thing that I want to ask on the spot here is about November 2020. So what do you see as what are the biggest challenges on your radar, and how do you anticipate trying to meet those?
I think we have the personal protective equipment done. I think we can manage that for November. One of the things we'll always tell you in elections is, in January, I didn't know what PPE was. So, like, what is it that's going to happen between now and November that I don't know what that is, and I'm going to have to figure out how to prepare for that. So it's always an event, and you never know what's going to happen. But I do think if all things kind of stay the way they are in that regard, I think that part is settled. There's a lot of discussion about vote by mail. Certainly, we've already seen the increase in that. And my concern going into November, sort of philosophically is the confidence in how the election is conducted, and that the voters will do what they need to do, that they will participate in whatever way they feel comfortable, whether that's vote by mail, whether that's showing up at their polling place on election day, but that they will show up and that they will vote, and that they will have confidence at the end of the election that the vote totals that are shown on election night or the next day reflect how the country and the localities voted. That's my biggest concern. For us personally as an office, it's the volume of vote by mail. So we went from 67 to 3,500 in an election that only votes, at about 30% to begin with. So what happens with 82% or 80% or more for a presidential election, and how many of those people will elect to do vote by mail? And how will I have a staff of, including me, there's 3 of us. So we almost died doing 3,000. So how are we going to do that, and just timelining that out in terms of stuffing envelopes and getting all of that, just the logistics of vote by mail. We will pre-process. I'm not as concerned about getting them counted because that's something that we took May and June to sort of pilot ourselves. We had never pre-processed before, but we did that. We were successful at doing that, and that I can see scaling. It's just the unknown of how voters will vote in November, and how will we manage that.
Yeah, I just want to underscore the point that you made about the legitimacy of elections, and making sure that however things go, and 2020 is the year of uncertainty, so something unpredictable is going to happen between now and election day, and to make sure that whatever those things are don't undermine the public's confidence in the electoral process, and as you said, in the numbers as they come out or roll out perhaps more slowly after election day, because that really is the whole ballgame. Like, if we don't have confidence in that process and in those numbers, then we literally don't have democracy. One of the things I've been trying to remind students and audiences that I talk with lately is that the United States doesn't have an election. We don't elect anything on a national ballot, right? We do not hold a single national election for anything, including president. We hold thousands of local elections simultaneously. And in some ways, I think that makes me feel better. So as a scholar of networks, one of the things I understand is that when you have a very bifurcated system that's so broken up into all of these component parts that are all connected by this process of trying to hold an election using slightly different ballots and slightly different procedures and slightly different formats, that what you actually build is a really resilient system. So in a way, the fact that we're doing thousands of elections at once on election day or over the course of a few weeks, through slightly different offices and different staff and different procedures, builds in a sort of resilience. So it's not like a hacker or a disruptor of some kind, foreign or domestic, can just come in and do one blanket thing to disrupt the whole election, because the balloting is so localized. That in a way, it's a benefit and a curse, right? So it's easy to imagine all the ways in which it's a curse because you can't actually coordinate anything. But it's a benefit because it provides a certain sense of security to the extent that we have really competent folks like yourself running these things at the local level. So I thank you for your service there.
Thank you. I think one of the to punctuate that a little bit is, if you talk to local election officers, so we say all elections are local because they're all run by local people. If you talk to local election officials, they will all indicate that they have a fairly high level of confidence in their election results, and that they have a fairly high confidence in their state's ability to report the correct results. And there are surveys out there being done by Reed University and Democracy Fund and so forth. And even Charles Stewart, who works out of the MIT lab, he sees this confidence among voters, that voters have confidence in their own locality, in their own state. What they're worried about is everybody else. And I think election officers have a real similar confidence. So if you put that together, I think most people in my position who are doing what I do, we do have confidence in our ability to run this election, to do it in a choiced sort of way. People have a choice of whether to vote by mail or whether to come on election day and vote. And we believe that both of those have a value and are secure. And so I think if you get caught up in what's being said out there, then it does look worse. But when you really talk to officials who want to be the trusted source for information, you'll see a higher level of confidence.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And as a Congress scholar, one of the paradoxes that we talk about in the congressional literature is this idea that people tend to really like their member of Congress and really hate Congress as a whole. So it's kind of that same thing where you have confidence in your local election, but maybe you have some misgivings about the broader election. And so from my perspective, then I just want to make sure we don't get caught in this weird paradox where everybody has faith in their local election, but nobody has faith in the larger election results. Like, we need to make sure that the sum of the parts is actually at least the whole, right? And that's more of a psychological game that can be a little bit tricky, but it's good, I think, to at least recognize it and articulate it. So thank you for that. Kristen, I want to move to you next. Tell us a little bit about what you expect to see from Mason's campus this coming up election season regarding all sorts of civic engagement activities, opportunities for students and faculty and staff and so forth. What's it going to look like?
Yeah, so we expect to see a lot of activity as we would in a typical year, although it's going to look completely different than it has in any other year. So we're not going to be in a capacity to host candidates on campus in the way that we had before, to host large events. We even don't necessarily know what capacity for hosting things like voter registration out and about is going to look like. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for faculty to incorporate this into their academic work, for student groups to really find ways to leverage this into group meetings, into different things. We're going to need a much more, I think, decentralized approach involving a lot of our partners to really be able to replicate some of the same energy and connection to voting that we can in a typical year, just given the fact that we're not going to have this large presence. Now, we are going to do everything we can to recreate that virtually. So you can expect to see virtual events as we can, where we can try to replicate watch parties and educational issue forums, that kind of thing. I think that'll absolutely be the goal, and to leverage social media and all the different tools that we have at our disposal to be able to engage, but trying to find ways to really connect this to folks personally, why they're voting, to connect to their academic interests, to connect to student groups. We're going to have a lot of opportunities there, I think, to partner with folks. So we would love to see involvement from faculty who have an interest, faculty who don't right now have an interest and are just seeing kind of an importance. Something that we've been thinking about is, I think it's harder to not include current events in your teaching than it has been before. I think people are so impacted by everything that's going on in our world. And so there's a huge opportunity to talk about voting, to talk about the impact of voting in discipline-specific ways. And so that's something that, we really want to see and are here to partner with faculty to be able to do. Same for student groups, right? We have a number of politically leaning student groups who will absolutely be active. They always are. But from groups who don't necessarily consider themselves political, but have issues they really care about or other things that connect those groups and those students, for them to be talking about how voting impacts this thing that they're passionate about too. We really need to be seeing that, I think, at a larger level to replicate, again, that kind of on-campus energy that you can have. We'll still have our polling place on campus. So for the students that are living on campus, there is still the opportunity, the convenience of voting in Merton Hall same day. That isn't going away, but it's going to be coming up with those points of connection to voting, which I think we know is really important for getting people to actually then go vote in whatever format they're doing it. That's going to be where we're really, I think, going to need a groundswell of campus support to make that happen.
So the political science literature tells us that one of the key indicators that we can use to determine whether or not somebody is likely to go vote is if someone else has asked them to vote.
Yeah.
Right. So if somebody asks me to go vote, it increases my likelihood of going to vote. That personal connection is a big deal. And particularly if it's somebody that I know or have some association with. or some connection to, even if I don't know them personally. So one of the things that comes to my mind that seems particularly tricky during the pandemic is in the before times, you could do all of these on-campus events and, public space drives and things like that, where it was easy to just stand out on a public space in campus and as people walk by, ask them to vote and really start to make those connections in a ready way. And that's going to be a lot harder to do. There's going to be a lot fewer people on campus, fewer people milling about. People may be reluctant to have that type of personal interaction with a stranger. And so this is where you're talking about all of the virtual happenings and virtual events and connections to organizations and so forth are going to be important. And the question that I'm wondering about is this. So if you're a chemistry professor or a math professor, or you teach in a subject area that really doesn't in an obvious way have a direct connection to politics or elections, do those faculty or do those instructors have an increased, I don't want to put too much of an onus on this, but like an increased responsibility to say something to their students or to put a link on their Blackboard page or to somehow incorporate hey, everybody should be registered to vote? Like, is there more onus on more faculty to help the campus community engage in voter registration and voter turnout in a way that might make some faculty feel uncomfortable?
Yeah. So I think the answer is yes. And I know the word onus is never a word that is going to resonate really well. But I say that because when we look at our election data from the 2016, our NSOLV data from the 2016 election, there's a notable discipline-based difference in voter turnout. So our overall voter turnout was about 64% of eligible voters voted. But when you look at disciplines,
which is great, that's awesome.
It's about 12 points higher than the national average for similar type institutions. So Mason already skews active, right? And probably by proxy of how close we are to DC and all these other things. But when you look at specific disciplines, I believe engineering, business, and the sciences like the chemistry, biology, biomedical sciences, they were at the low 50s, right? So 12 to 15 points lower than other disciplines. When you looked at history, education, they were voting much higher. They're in the 70% for turnout. And it's not hard to make a connection that perhaps in a history course, you're talking about elections and the importance of elections, or perhaps in an education course, you're seeing a little bit more the connection there. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for faculty who are teaching in some of these sciences. Let's say you're an engineering faculty. You don't have to make it a political conversation. You don't have to make it a partisan conversation, but you can drill down to if you're going to be doing some sort of public engineering, your local officials matter because they're making decisions about zoning, right? Which is going to ultimately impact your funding and your ability to do your work. Or if you're in any kind of sciences, the administration definitely determines how much funding is available for science research. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a political conversation as much as you should follow the dollars as you vote for campaigns and figure out who makes decisions about these things that will impact your career. So I think because our data shows us that there is a difference in these disciplines and who's voting and who's not, we have a huge opportunity for faculty who can speak with authority about how voting impacts those fields, to be able to encourage to do exactly what you're saying, which is be that person who then asks and suggests voting. And if you have class that day, you can incorporate it into a lecture, and or you can say we're not having class today because we want to give people the opportunity to vote. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to support the act of voting. Or things like National Voter Registration Day. There'll be email communication that goes out about that. There is every year. It'll come from the president. But you can underscore, you should have received an email today from the president about National Voter Registration Day. This is a reminder. There's things you can do throughout the course leading up to Election Day that don't have to be diving really into the partisan ways that we talk about politics sometimes, but can really just be talking about, personally for you, this is an impact. We saw increased voting in 2018, lower than 16, but increased compared to the previous kind of off-year cycle. And so I think it will still go up this year. But if we can have students who didn't necessarily think that they had a reason to vote, and if that can come from encouragement from faculty in their classes, I think it's an amazing opportunity for faculty.
That's great. So if you pragmatically, imagine that you have the opportunity, every Mason faculty is now going to listen to you for 3 minutes. If there are 3 top things that you could ask them to do from a very practical standpoint particularly thinking about faculty who are maybe reluctant to bring politics into their courses in any way. What are the things that you'd really like to encourage them to consider?
Yeah. So three very simple, I think, things that faculty could know and bring up in class that are not necessarily partisan in any way is one, the Merton Hall campus polling location. So if you have students, we'll have about 4,500 students, I believe, who are residing on campus, depending how the next month goes, but we should have about 4,500 students on campus. They absolutely can register and should register on campus, and they can vote right there on campus. Obviously, depending how things pan out, there might be students who make different choices about how they vote, but that's one thing to know. There is a polling location on campus. Encourage your students who are on campus to do that. Our voting numbers for first-year students were lower compared to other years in our NSOLV data. Some of that could be they're not all eligible yet to vote. Some could be a greater sense of social responsibility as you move through higher education. But so specifically, if you have a class of first-year students, to really make sure that they know that there's an option to vote on campus. I think another thing would be, we have a website, masonvotes.gmu.edu. So that would be the second thing, really practical thing I would tell faculty to know, and include that in your information. That website, we pull information from the county, we work with the state, we make sure the information is accurate, but it's curated specifically with George Mason students in mind. So we make sure to put a little note that if you do register with your location on campus, you have to include the name of your residence hall building or your registration won't go through. We know that's an issue. We'll make sure to flag it. So if there's questions that faculty don't know all the details of, if you direct students to masonvotes.gmu.edu, we'll also have issue forum dialogue there, podcast episodes, links to all of our social media where there are events that are happening with candidates or just student group events. All of that information will be there too. So you don't have to know it all. You can send students to those different sites. And I think a third thing to do would be to encourage your students, give 5 minutes of your class time for students to research how to vote and make a plan for voting. I think when we looked at the data and NSOLV data from 2016, about 85% of our students voted on election day in person. About 11% voted absentee, and we had less than 1% do early voting or other mail-in voting that wasn't absentee. I think that's going to level out this year. I don't know that it's going to be exactly quarters, but I think we're going to have many more students who aren't living on campus. We might have students voting in all 50 states, right? So there's going to be a lot of students who have different dates, deadlines, ways of voting. And so if you gave 5 minutes of your class time to say, look up information for voting, whether and how you want to vote, and make a plan for doing it, and write down all the dates and deadlines you need to be able to vote in whatever way that is. I think that'd be a third really helpful, encouraging thing faculty could do that, again, isn't a particularly partisan thing to do.
Yeah, I've had the idea of giving my students an assignment where they have to have a voting buddy, where everybody has one person that they're sort of accountable to. Make sure that person is registered to vote. They're going to make sure you're registered to vote. Make sure you turn in your ballot or have your plan to go and vote or whatever it is, so that as a pair, you're keeping each other accountable in that way. I was thinking also about the point that you made about first-year students, and it reminds me that, so I said earlier, the political science literature talks about you're being more likely to go and vote if somebody asks you to vote. Well, we also know that you're more likely to go vote the more sort of connected to your community that you feel. The deeper connections you feel to the community where you live, the more likely you are to vote. And first-year students many of whom have just moved. They've just left the nest, as it were, and have either they're now living on campus or whatnot. And they've just uprooted themselves. And people who just moved at any age level are less likely to vote than people who've lived in their communities for a long time. So it could just be that basic thing. But it also occurs to me that I think college students, and back me up if you read this the same way or not, I believe that college students often feel unsure if they should register to vote or remain registered to vote back in their home district where their parents live, or if they should register on campus. What advice would you give to students who are struggling with that question?
Yeah, and it's even muddier this year, right? Because I think we're going to have students who are on campus and are fully virtual, so that connection might still feel a little different to like the issues, right? If you're not seeing that happening on campus and those issues coming out, and Mason being in a situation where our age demographic looks different than other schools, like we don't our average first year student isn't 18 to 21. A lot of them are, but that isn't actually our average first year student. So you can actually see from our NSLV data, our students who are over 50 are voting at 85% rates, and our students that are first year students are voting at 60% or less. So you can see that, like, and these are, going to be adults who are embedded into their communities, who are voting, who maybe have kids in school and have different reasons to vote. So you absolutely see that in Mason's data. But I think this year it's really looking at, it makes a lot of sense to vote for the issues that are going to impact you and the issues that are going to impact your community. If you make a choice to stay registered to vote, if you're living on campus, you make a choice to stay registered to vote at home. That certainly is a personal choice for college students. Just know that, there's more steps you have to go through to make sure that you get your ballot, you return it on time. You don't get that same sort of satisfaction of same day voting and the convenience of an on-campus polling location that you might get. So I think it's a personal decision that I think a lot of folks made. I grew up in a state that was never a swing state, and I went to college in a state that was. So I was super excited. I waited to register until I got to college so I could register in that state, and feel like my first presidential election would make a big difference. And so I think those are considerations you can certainly make too about when it makes sense to switch your vote. And I know we're going to have students who are making a lot of choices about how to vote this year, and the first of which is going to be where to register, and then there's a number of other safety decisions and timing decisions that they'll have to make. So it's very much a personal decision. I think just making sure you know the differences in the rules and how you vote. We've had students that you didn't realize you have to request, right, the absentee ballot. And so knowing that every step, every process, or every mode of voting has a different process for voting. And so just knowing that up front and being ready that you're armed with that information, I think is the best way to answer the kind of how to vote.
That's really good advice. Thinking about, at the end of the day, it's still voting is a personal thing. Like, it's a social thing, but it's also an individualistic thing. And so in a way, the fact that we sort of have more choices now about how to vote is kind of a good thing, but sometimes more choices is also a bad thing. We get paralyzed. But that's a nice opportunity, I think, that the point that you just made, and actually whoever wants to answer this one, I'm going to ask to jump in. I won't point it at any particular person, but it's a good opportunity to remind our audience about the recent changes to election laws in Virginia, and what profound impact that has on the 2020 November election. Can anybody succinctly summarize those changes for the audience?
I'll do that.
Great. Jean, go ahead.
The biggest thing is that Virginia is now joining the ranks of states with true early voting. As of July 1st, there will no longer be an excuse required to vote absentee, which can be in person at an election office or a satellite election office, or by mail, which is also called vote at home. So the terms absentee voting and early voting are now going to be interchangeable here in Virginia, and no excuse is going to be required. Anybody can vote early. So you have to be registered in Virginia by the 13th of October. Early voting in Fairfax County is going to start on October 14th. And there are going to be at least 14 locations where you can go in the county and vote in person early. And you'll just need to show some sort of ID. But that leads into our second big change, is that a photo ID will no longer be required. I haven't been working in elections quite this long, but I understand the laws are now going back to how they were in 2004. Brenda maybe can correct me on that. You still had to have some kind of ID, but it can now be just that little postcard you get in the mail when you register to vote, or a utility bill, or a paycheck. So I think most people are going to still flash the photo ID because they've gotten used to it over the years, but it doesn't have to be a photo ID. And that may help Mason students who maybe, if they left their student ID back in the dorm, maybe they've got something else on their person that still identifies them in some way. And we'll have a list at all the polling locations of what those IDs, valid IDs are, as we always do.
That's super helpful. And it behooves me as a political scientist I can't help but to add just a little bit of context and history about this here, because I think this point is so important, and to understand how we got here. You know, democracy is only a democracy because there's voting, right? If you don't have voting, you don't have a democracy. And for most of the history in the United States, by most measures that a political scientist would use, we weren't really a full democracy. And in a lot of ways, we aren't now. It's really the period between 1965, when the Voting Rights Act passes, and 2013, when a Supreme Court decision called Shelby County versus Holder came down. That period between 65 and 2013 is the height of voter expansion. That is the period in which it was easiest for the most people in the United States to vote. And before 1965, there were all sorts of restrictions on being able to vote by race and by gender and other categories. And since 2013, we've seen an increasing uptick in the number of restrictions that are limiting people's access to voting, particularly with the use of things like voter ID laws, and other things that are restricting all sorts of citizens to vote because of some concerns about, ostensibly it's concerns about electoral security, but it's all wrapped up in the history of the United States, in which we have this deep and insidious history of limiting non-white people from the ballot box. That racial history is just really rich there. So in a way, it's a shame that we've backslid a little bit since 2013, but it's very encouraging that here in Virginia, we've been able to correct that a little bit with the change. So you still need an ID to vote. You just don't need a photo ID, and you don't need the excuse to do the absentee ballot. So those are definitely moves in the right direction in terms of suffrage expansion. So that's great to know. And so go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in on one of that. If you don't have ID, one of the IDs that are still required for voting, there is a statement that you will sign. This was the case before we went to photo ID. So there is a statement that the voter will be required to sign in order to vote that just says, I don't have any of these IDs with me, but I am who I say I am. And then they would be allowed to vote. So I think that's an important point. I think you're absolutely right that most people, certainly my experience because I have been doing this long enough that I did it a long time under the old rules, is that people will just come up and show their driver's license and they expect to show ID. So that's not really the issue. And the other thing I wanted to say is that absentee actually in person begins on September 28th, not in October. So we have 45 days. We'll still have the same 45 days of in-person voting, and then our mailed ballots are required to be mailed by September 28th. So that first wave will go out in mid-September.
So that raises a question for me that I'm wondering.
September 18, just looking at the calendar, September 18.
So just to clarify, September 18th is the day that absentee ballots can be requested or can begin to be returned.
Great distinction, thank you. So you can request a ballot now for November. You can go online.
Oh, you can.
And request. We already have across Virginia thousands of requests for absentee ballots to be mailed. So that is open now, or you can submit a paper absentee ballot request for that to be mailed to you. There's no more application requirement for in-person, and so it's the in-person that will begin on Friday, September 18th. And also that is the deadline for local offices to mail their first round of ballots. So for example, for clarity, if you were to submit your application today, then in that first batch of ballots that we're going to send out, we have to have those in the mail by September 18th. And that's when the first batch will go. After that, if you submitted an application on September 20th, then you'd get that ballot like a week later. So from technically from September 18th on, we'll continue to send out the ballots that we get applications for. But if you submit that application now, you're going to get it somewhere in the September 18 range.
So if I submit my application for an absentee ballot today, then I can expect to get that ballot in the mail shortly after September 18th, I could turn it around the same day and technically have voted in the 2020 presidential election a good 6 weeks or so before Election Day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The biggest challenge that we found with students in terms of returning those ballots is the stamp. So if
What's
I
that?
were exactly. So if I were contemplating as a professor how I might help my students, and I don't work on campus, so I don't even know if this would be appropriate, but I might tell students, hey, if you apply for an absentee ballot, I'm going to come to class next week, or I'm, whatever the environment is for interacting with students, here's a stamp, because that was a big issue in 2016. And I know there were organizations on campus that were trying to mitigate that with students and help them get a stamp and get that ballot back in the mail. And I think that is why more of them want to vote in person, is because even just that little hurdle of getting a stamp on it and getting it back in the mail.
At the end of the day, a stamp is still a physical object. You can't just click on it. It strikes me as a potentially constitutionally sticky poll tax of 2020 in the way that hadn't been in the past. That it seems like it might behoove local governments to offer to do some sort of nonprofit, no postage required. That would be nice.
So we did for May and for June in our local election, we did provide postage. Jury is still out, just because you can imagine if we were to mail out so many that would be a big budget concern right now. And I'm not saying we will or we won't, I'm just not real sure about that. There is legislation that has to pass a second round. So it'll be brought up again in 2021 that requires localities to provide return postage on ballots. And I'll be curious to see how many can go ahead and do that this year, and then whether or not that will pass the General Assembly a second time in order to bring that out.
That sounds really sensible, but also pretty expensive. I don't even know how much postage is these days, but I know it adds up fast when you're talking about it at that scale. So a few minutes ago, Kristen was talking about that the average first-year student at George Mason is not the traditional age undergrad, and so that was my transition moment to come over to Jean. So let me recorrect the course of our conversation here. So Jean, I'm so pleased that you're here. You've had a ton of experience in elections in a variety of different kinds of positions over the course of your lifetime and your career. What role or experience have you had in the past that you feel like is most informative about how you will approach the 2020 elections?
Well, I've been working with elections, or in elections, I could say, since November 2013, when a neighbor of mine who saw us walking our dog stopped and said, hey, how about if you work as an election officer? And I said, okay. And I got bitten by the bug, and pretty hard. And found my calling late in life. Working as an election officer is all about adrenaline, patience, and stamina. And I think I go to it adrenaline by about 7 in the morning and just go on fumes the rest of the day. Getting ready for November, what's helping the most there is that we got to do a dry run in the June primary. Everything, the layout of the room had to be redesigned for social distancing, not just between the voters, but between the election officers as well. Normally, I'd have 2 people sitting at a table helping voters. I can't do that. I can only have 1 person at a table. And so everything had to be spaced out. Lots of lines, arrows, and signage to try to get people, to go the right way and stay apart from each other. And so it gave us a chance to try out all these new procedures. Most people, poll workers brought their own cloth masks. The county provided disposable masks, gloves. We had disinfectants and paper towels to wipe things off. The state of Virginia, Department of Elections provided disposable pens, so we could offer a voter a pen if they didn't have their own. And we also, to some people's disappointment, did away with the I voted sticker.
Oh, yeah.
I know. That is literally, according to some studies, a huge motivator for people who vote. And
No.
by not doing that, we eliminated a voter interaction, but I think we also lose something in the process. So that gave us a dry run to figure out what's November is going to be like. I've already been having nightmares about how to run this election for November based on what the turnout was in 2016 at my own polling place. When we opened the doors at 6 a.m., I had hundreds of people already in line in 2016. So here I'm thinking, all right, what's that going to be like in 2020? And now that's all been flipped on its head. I have no idea what it's going to be like in 2020. If we are trying to do the same number of voters in person as we did in 2016, then you're going to see enormous lines. We've got to get people out of the precincts, out of the polling places, and have them voting by mail or voting early. Because there's no way you can funnel, in my case, 4,000 voters through a precinct in 13 hours and keep them all socially distant and have it not take an unreasonable length of time. Normally for a presidential election, I would have 5 check-in tables, and I would have 16 tables for voters to mark their ballots. I'm only going to have room for 3 check-ins. I'm only going to have room for maybe 10 voting stations. And to compound that, this is the cycle when we see constitutional amendments on the ballot in Virginia, and there are 2. Don't ask me what they are. And in Fairfax County, we will also have 4 bond issues. And much as we would like voters to read up on all these things and decide ahead of time, like, in California, we're going to get that big pamphlet in the mail and you've got 25 referenda to decide on. They don't. They come in and they sit down and they read this long, long ballot. So the voter is going to take longer to mark the ballot. So the only solution that I can see is getting people out of the polling place to vote early or vote by mail. Chris Piper, who is the commissioner of the Virginia Department of Elections, has said that he wants to see 50% of voters voting some other way, whether that's by mail or early. And the best thing you can do to help people like Brenda is, if you're going to vote by mail, is do it early. Like you said, Jennifer, you can request your ballot now, but then get it as early as late September. Fairfax County has a drop box outside of the government center where you can drop a ballot. That's not real common for some reason in Virginia. You see it a lot of other places. But with the concerns that are being expressed about the viability of the Postal Service, using that drop box is a way that a voter can kind of take that into their own hands and be assured that that ballot got back to their local office of elections securely.
That's a really good point. And it emphasizes for me one of the topics that we haven't talked about much yet, having to do with people's concerns about election security. So one of the messages that's clearly coming out of this podcast is vote early and vote at home, or vote by mail. Reminds me of the old adage that I used to associate with the old-timey elections in Chicago: vote early, vote often. That was a corrupt thing to do. But today we're actually giving it as real advice: vote early and vote by mail. Not often, but by mail. You only get to vote once. And that does seem to be good advice, but there does seem to still be a fair number of folks out there who are concerned about voting by mail and wonder about the security of voting by mail. And then thinking about things like using a drop box, which is a good way to get around the postage issue, is again, something that is maybe available more to people who have cars or who are, savvy enough to be able to do that and to know where that is. And that doesn't reach all parts of the population equally. You have to accept some COVID risk to take public transportation to go drop off your ballot at a place like that. So both in terms of the inequities about how these things affect populations differently, and concerns about people's security. I guess these are two very different questions. But do you have any experience in your own personal experience in helping to administer elections that give you either some sense of pause or reassurance on either of those topics?
Yes, mostly a sense of pause. And a sense of where the governmental entities can do better. A lot of people do express concern about voting by mail. It is entirely unjustified, as study after study after study has borne out. It is completely safe, but it is very much a process that is, it's much more difficult for those who are less advantaged in many different ways. Let's say you want to ask for an absentee ballot by mail in Virginia. You need to go on to the website to get that. You can do it all online if you have a Virginia driver's license or ID, what we call a walker's card. Well, what if you don't have a Virginia driver's license? Then you have to you can print that application. That's another problem that's become a really, really a big issue this year. Is we're realizing an awful lot of people don't have printers at home. That's assuming they had internet to start with. So there's no printer at home. There's no stamp to mail it in. Okay, so then you could call your local elections office and you can request it over the phone. You don't have to do it by computer but the person has to work really hard to get that ballot application and to get that sent in. And it's too hard. And what I'd like to see is one of two things: is either a massive push by the state or the localities to educate voters on the different ways to get an absentee application, or if they're offering in-person voting, early voting, how to do that. And the dates and times and all that varies by locality. Or actually proactively mail an absentee ballot application, not a ballot, but an application to every registered voter. That may be something that's beyond the budgets of an awful lot of jurisdictions. Brenda's got 3 people in her office, and that's actually fairly common. A lot of election offices in Virginia have a full-time registrar who may have other duties in addition to that, and maybe a couple part-time employees. They don't have the resources to do this, but a county like Fairfax could certainly they could certainly mail out applications to every voter if they so chose. So it is biased.
Are you seeing any push for that? Is there advocacy or public discussion along those lines?
I'm not seeing it. There is advocacy within one party I know of to make the process itself easier. Once you get that absentee ballot, you've applied for it, you get it back in the mail. It comes in a packet, and you have to have a witness that watches you open your ballot. Now, I'm not really sure what that's supposed to prove from a security point of view, but that's what the law says. Then after you've voted your ballot, and assuming you have that stamp, you have to fill out the outside of that envelope with your name, your address, and your signature, which are interestingly pre-printed on a label on the outside of that same envelope. Again, what purpose does this serve? We don't know, but that's how the law was written. So there is a party that wants to reduce those hurdles, eliminate the witness requirement, which was waived for the June primary only as a result of a lawsuit by the ACLU. As it stands now, all the requirements are back in force for the November election, and your guess is as good as mine as to whether any of that will get waived by lawsuit, by executive order? I don't know. I really don't. But that's why my preference, I think, is if we can get as many people to do early voting, at least in Fairfax County, where we're fortunate enough to have so many satellite locations where you can vote early. A number of them are accessible by car and by public transportation. They're mostly at government centers. So for those who don't have the internet, don't have a printer at home, don't have a stamp, whatever, that gives them a way to vote at their convenience without exposing them to potentially larger crowds on election day. But election day has to stay staffed for voters with language issues and people with accessibility issues. We have to provide those options. And that's where I think we're doing such a good job in this county is we were able to keep all 243 precincts open in June. You didn't see us in the news like Georgia, Wisconsin, Kentucky, pick a state that closed polling places. That's really disenfranchises people.
Yeah, it does. So that's a positive thing. So we have some challenges in Virginia to enfranchisement through all of these hoops that you have to jump through in order to do an absentee ballot properly to make sure it's counted.
Right.
Those are restricting the suffrage right, really. But to your point, the idea that we haven't had to close polling places, or we haven't experienced that yet, that is a positive. Jean, I want to ask you one last thing.
Sure.
So clearly, one of your messages here is the vote early message. And the vote by home or vote in person early. But if beyond that, if you're speaking to your fellow student peers and they are as anxious as you are to help see this democratic process go smoothly and effectively and to see high turnout, what are some suggestions that you want to give to your peers about how to be civically engaged in responsible ways through this election season?
Two things. Register to vote three things. Register to vote. Check your registration. So many students are registered at home, as Kristen pointed out, and they might want to register to vote on campus. They'll need to add their dorm address and write that in as an extra item because that's a special kind of thing with Mason because it's so large. The third thing is to volunteer to be an election officer. The average age of election officers in this country is, 72, 74 years old, something like that. The number of people who can't work or who choose not to work for health reasons is just skyrocketing. And we were able to staff the June election. There are some predictions that this fall could look worse than things do right now if we have a bad seasonal flu season. That is hitting right kind of at the beginning of when the voting season starts up, because the early voting will start in October. Things could get really ugly really fast come October and November, and we're going to need more poll workers anyway, and this is a national problem. As many people as possible need to be volunteering to work as election officers, and you do get paid. It's not a ton, but you do get paid, so it's not really volunteer.
And what's involved with becoming an election officer? Can you just very briefly describe what somebody would need to do?
Sure. The first thing is you need to be a registered voter. And in Virginia, if you're a registered voter in Charlottesville, you can work as an election officer in Fairfax. You just have to be a registered voter in the state. The rules are different in other states. Some places you have to be registered in the place where you're going to serve, but not here. So you need to be a registered voter. And that obviously, since only citizens can vote, that means you're over 18, you're a citizen. And you attend a online training class, because like everything, we've had to go virtual with our training. That takes a couple hours. And then you're trained, you're ready to work. You'll be assigned as close to where you live as possible, but people who are willing to maybe go 5 miles, 10 miles away from home, we appreciate that. makes things a little easier. There's always a shortage of Republican people who identify, as Republican being an election officer. We try to balance the number of Republicans and Democratic election officers in each precinct as much as we can. But we're having trouble finding enough of the red team to be part of the process.
All right. That's great advice. And really practical. And I'm conscious of the time. So listen, let me say that this has been just tremendous. The three of you, the wealth of knowledge and combined experience that you have. I could go on for another hour asking questions and stoking ideas and coming up with grand plans and giving suggestions. But I want to be conscious of your time and of our audience's time as well. So I'm going to pause things here and invite any of you. Does anybody have a last word of advice or comment or question to co-panelists that you really are dying to jump in with before we tie this off?
I do have one.
Oh.
Brenda and then Jean. Well, let me just give everybody one last go. So Brenda.
Okay, so I would like to address your students on this point of registering to vote. So one of the really sad things that has happened to me in almost every presidential election that I have worked in is a student will come in and they aren't actually registered where they think they are registered. So Jean, thank you so much for telling them. First of all, thank you for your service, Jean, because without the front line of election officers, we couldn't do this. But students come in and they're not registered where they think they are registered. And one of the ways that this happens, which will be different, I think, this year, is that you have third-party organizations who go on the campus and they really want to register students. And they'll hand a student a registration address, with even on GMU, we've had cases where they'll hand a registration with the Ravenna Way address already written on the application. Well, that student actually lives in the city of Fairfax. They don't live on campus. And so they're essentially disenfranchising themselves by registering on campus where that's not where they live. Or they'll come to vote in person, early voting in person in one of those 45 days, and we'll look them up and they are now registered in at somewhere in Norfolk State because somebody came onto that campus and said, hey, you should register to vote on campus. And so they do that and they forget that takes them out of where they were previously registered and puts them in their new place. So they just need to be thoughtful about what that means to register to vote and make sure that the address that they're using is the address where they either go to school or where they live. So that's just a heartache for me when someone comes in and then they're not able to vote because they didn't understand what they were doing when they filled out a new application to do that. I would also drive people to the online registration whenever possible, just because that is an easier process. They can certainly do it on paper. They can apply to vote by paper, but that also is a much more laborious process for the local election departments as well to deal with all the paper, whereas the online process is much faster and you'll get your ballot or your registration faster that way. I don't know I feel like I'm rambling here, but I don't know what's going to happen with the witness signature. I know that is still being discussed. And part of that is because Virginia does not have signature verification. So it's this way between security of your ballot, making sure that you're the person who opens that ballot and votes that ballot. We've all heard about ballot harvesting. We certainly, don't want people with an agenda going around and taking people's ballots. So I think when you said, election security, it's like access and security always being weighed into how we can maintain that confidence for the voter that their ballot was cast by them and that it counted. So there's some interesting background there on why Virginia has that affidavit on the envelope that has to be signed, and then also has the witness signature because we don't have signature verification yet. will we get there now that we're going more to by mail? I think you'll see that legislatively coming up. And just thank you so much, Professor, for having me on. I appreciate your trusting me to provide information to your podcast listeners. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Jean, your final words.
Vote.virginia.gov. Professors and other Mason student engagement should start talking to students in September, right after Labor Day, about going to the online portal and having students check where they're registered. I had to turn away somebody in June who was registered in Williamsburg. She went to William and Mary and came home because of COVID-19 and hadn't updated her registration. If people start checking their registrations in September and figuring out, now where am I registered? That gives them time to update their registration before the deadline of October 13th. Then when early voting, or then they can do an absentee application, they can vote early, they can vote by mail, however they want to do it. But as Brenda was saying, getting that registration up to date early then opens the doors to all the different ways that people can vote.
Excellent advice. Excellent advice. Kristen.
Yes. So the one thing I first will promise you, I took a note about stamps. So we'll make sure we'll brainstorm the stamp solution, whether it's just putting on the website where on campus you can buy stamps. We'll address stamps for sure.
I'm willing to start a GoFundMe for stamps, by the way.
For all the
put me in
stamps.
for that.
Yeah, the bookstore doesn't
Absolutely.
sell them.
No, I think there are locations, but I will coalesce that and we'll find a way to make that happen. So stamps I wrote down for sure. And then I would just, a second encouragement, I think, to faculty to think about how you can be one of those voices who encourages students to vote, knowing that they're going to be looking for any type of encouragement because it's going to look a bit differently. And the way you can tie it to really practical things that they care about by virtue of being in your course, I think that's a great thing for faculty. And for students and everyone, I think one of the things we didn't talk about is just spend some time looking down ballot on the issues. I know there's occasionally there can be apathy or different opinions on presidential candidates, and we spend a lot of time talking about that. But a lot of these other local elections, local officials, city council, board of ed, all these other ones that are coming up that Jean so graciously talked about, how people spend a lot of time reading those when they're voting. I think doing that for your own education to get in and out of voting a little faster if you're voting in person, but also just to really know what's on your ballot and spend some time digging into that while making your plan for voting, I think are the two sort of takeaways that I would add.
That's really useful. So you had mentioned the masonvotes.gmu.edu,
yes.
and Jean had mentioned the vote.virginia.gov. If we were going to ask all faculty to put one of those two websites on their syllabus, which one would be better? I'm going to go look at them when we're done here. But can either of you think immediately which one would be better to recommend for all faculty to tell students to go?
We certainly have the other one on ours as well, but
Okay.
I think it depends probably what the faculty, sorry, Jean, I cut you off. I think it probably depends what the faculty is looking for as the primary resource. If they really want very specific to Mason student who maybe is living on campus or in Fairfax County, I think masonvotes.gmu.edu is helpful. It's currently being updated with more and more information. As we get closer to November, it'll be more real-time issues and that kind of thing. But of course, the state website is going to have the most updated. If anything changes, we'd update what they update after. So if you want real time, the most update, that probably is the best source.
Okay. Jean, were you going to pipe in there too?
I almost would lean towards the Mason Vote site, because then you could include information. You could have links there to, I can't think of what the site is, but there are some sites that give reputable links to other states. There are students who go to Mason and who live out of state, or even, like the one who lived in Williamsburg. They still want to vote in their home location. And in that case, they may need to be dealing with different deadlines, different requirements. Sometimes you have to declare a party in some states. Mason Votes gives us some extra space to put some information out there. One thing about the first-year students that Kristen brought up, that they vote in lower numbers, I wanted to point out that I know in Fairfax County they do a tremendous amount of outreach to the seniors in high school in their government classes, but they had to stop doing all that. And assuming that's done elsewhere, we're going to have a lot of people coming to Mason for the first time as freshmen who maybe didn't get registered to vote in high school at the numbers that we've seen in past years. So voter registration nationally has dropped off massively, and this is a concern for getting turnout numbers up.
That's a really excellent
That's a
point.
great
That's and specific to the pandemic year.
I agree with the Mason website too, even as the official voting person here who would want to go to the government website. I think as long as the Mason website has that link, that there is, as Jean said, and I hope it was Jean that I thanked for her election officer service. I don't know.
Yes,
You did.
Right,
you.
but I think that's a good call on that, because there's an opportunity to provide more information. So.
Well, listen, I'm going to talk to the Stearns Center and the other powers that be at Mason to see if we can't make, they make recommendations all the time about templates and certain things that need to be on syllabi as we come into the fall semester. And I'm going to see if we can't do something about getting some voting information as recommended language on everybody's syllabi that could reach a larger audience. So that'll be on my list. So we all have a to-do list. Panelists and audience alike, we all have some homework to do after this. But I want to thank you, each of you individually, Kristen, Jean, and Brenda, for your time and for your expertise and all of the information and good ideas that you have shared here. I know there's a lot more that we all could say. Maybe we'll do an episode 2 as we get closer to the election. If you're agreeable, I think that would be fantastic. So let me tie things up here and end the podcast and just say thank you very much. And a quick reminder to everybody to go to the websites that have been mentioned and make sure you're registered to vote and apply for your absentee ballots today. I think I'll go and do that this afternoon. All right. Thanks very much to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.